Yes. Well, good evening. I'd say good afternoon, but I guess we're getting closer to evening, right? Thank you for being here to each and every one of you, especially to our speakers and to our board. My name is Sherry Donahue. I'm the board chair for the Historic Preservation Board. 1, 2, 3, HPB, yes. And so I just want to let you know tonight we're going to have some conversations that will help everyone appreciate why we're going to all this trouble. And so most of you in this room know all the trouble it's been just to get to this point. So we'll get into that soon. But I would like to introduce our board, who I have right here: Maura Sandoval, Letha Bowles, and Lynn Horner. And we have one other board member who is on the way, so we'll introduce her when she gets here. So we just want to say thank you for being here again. And, you know, there's not, as I said, there's not a whole lot that we can say to people who really understand the beauty and the reason for preserving our history. And so we brought together people to get tonight who could give you, answer your questions and to give you a real understanding of what it is we're going to be doing as we move forward into this process. And you also know that it's our 2025 celebration year for our centennial. So what a better time to do this work than now, to get started on this work. And so with that, I want to introduce a few other people. So I want to make sure that you know everybody is, who the players are, who can, when you're starting to think about what your questions are, who will answer them for you. So joining us also this evening, our City Attorney, Pam Shoshone. We have our Community Development Director, Michael Sherman. We have his Administrative Assistant, Marissa Robinson, keeping you guessing which way to look. We have our Deputy City Clerk, Jen Hodges, and our Senior Executive Assistant, Jeannie Barlow. Also with us tonight is Daniel Udi, by the way, one of our own, Temple Terrace resident, who is the owner of Pro Historical, Danny, and Robin Baker, who is Plant City's Planning and Zoning Coordinator. And all these people will help us with tonight's presentation. So as we begin, we do recognize that history is history. And sometimes you can remember it one way, and sometimes you remember it another way, or sometimes it's portrayed in one way. But buildings, they are what they are. And unless we mess with them, history remains. It is preserved. And so tonight, the question is, why do we need to preserve our history? Well, we're all in this to create a sense of space in our beautiful city and to appreciate that we actually are a historical district. You know, when your city is turning 100, we're the whole set of us. We are historical. So in our efforts, by the way, to create this, back in the 70s, we started attempting to create a sense of place and a sense of value to our historic buildings. It took us a while to get it together. Obviously, some of you have been around since 1970. There are people in here who have not been, but we won't point them out. And so about 2 years ago, the city really worked in earnest to make sure that this happened. And so then recently as 2023, City Council, thank you. By the way, I failed to introduce two of our very important members. Mr. James Chambers is here tonight from the City Council. Mr. Gil Shishler from here. They're trying to hide in the back row. It's not working. So they actually pulled it off and got together, and 2 years ago, and historic, I want to make sure I read this right, City Council adopted Historic Preservation Ordinance 1550 on August 15th, 2023, and then created this Voluntary Historic Preservation Board on November 7th of 2023. So we've made a lot of progress. Progress is slow, but we had time, right? We had to make sure we did it in the right time, and that's why we're here tonight. So tonight we're going to discuss all the aspects of historic preservation, as many as we can get from our wonderful speakers. And at the end of the night, at the end of the presentations, we will have time for questions and answers. So now we're going to start the program with a review of the certified local government and the Historic Preservation Ordinance and program incentives. So I'll turn that over to our presenter as he right behind me. There you go.
Why is historic preservation important? Historic buildings and site have an intrinsic value. They tell the story of our past and contribute to the cultural and aesthetic of a community. Built from a higher quality natural materials, these buildings have withstood the test of time and are more environmentally and structurally sound. The preservation of historic properties ensure that the city of Temple Terrace's unique character and identity are maintained. Historic preservation is a tool that can develop community pride, revitalize neighborhoods and downtowns, spur economic development, promote tourism, and educate community residents in their shared heritage. Historic preservation leads to a civic improvement, and many communities use historic preservation to protect important existing historic properties and chart the path for maintaining them. What is the Certified Local Government Program? The Certified Local Government Program was enacted as a part of the National Historic Preservation Act amendments of 1980. The program links 3 levels of government: federal, state, and local, into the Preservation Partnership for identification, evaluation, and protection of historic properties. Certified local governments are municipal and county governments which have made historic preservation a public policy through the passage of a historic preservation ordinance. Participation in the CLG program allows local governments to partner with state and federal agencies and other CLGs to share preservation ideas, experiences, as well as opportunities to compete for CLG grants. Across the nation, hundreds of diverse communities have taken action to preserve their unique historic character. The CLG program has been a major source of support and guidance. This national initiative provides valuable technical assistance and grants to local governments seeking to keep what is important and significant for future generations. Funds are appropriated annually by the U.S. Congress and distributed from the Historic Preservation Fund, which is administered by the National Park Service and the State Historic Preservation Office in each state. The CLG program responds to the needs of many different kinds of local communities throughout the nation and link them to the National Historic Preservation Program established by the National Historic Preservation Act. What are the benefits of becoming a CLG? The Certified Local Government Program allows municipalities to participate more directly in the state and federal historic preservation programs, which include access to funding. States receive annual appropriations from the Federal Historic Preservation Fund. States are required to give at least 10% of their funding to CLGs as subgrants. Grants that are available to municipalities include small matching grants for funds from $10,000 to $50,000 and special category grants for funds up to $500,000. These grants can fund a wide variety of projects, including surveys, National Registry nominations, rehabilitation work, design guidelines, education programs, training, structural assessments, and feasibility studies, to name a few. Access to technical assistance is also provided. As a CLG, communities have direct access to State Historic Preservation Office staff for assistance with their Historic Preservation Board, building assessments, surveys and nominations, and general preservation assistance. State staff and National Park Service staff offer regular training to CLGs as an added benefit. Preservation in a CLG program requires that all municipalities must first adopt a historic preservation ordinance and create a historic preservation board that conforms to the Florida Certified Local Government Guidelines prior to submitting a CLG application to the State Historic Preservation Office. The City of Temple Terrace City Council adopted Historic Preservation Ordinance 1550 on August 15, 2023, and created a Historic Preservation Board on November 7, 2023. The city subsequently submitted its CLG application to the state on March 29, 2024, and received confirmation that the application was approved on May 1, 2024. Now, the State Historic Preservation Office will sign the CLG agreement and then, through the Division of Historic Resources, will send a request for certification to the National Park Service. The National Park Service typically sends notice of certification within a month of receipt of the CLG agreement.
The provisions of the city's Historic Preservation Ordinance are designed to identify, protect, restore, and encourage the reuse of historic resources. all of which are essential to the city's health and safety and its economical, educational, cultural, and general welfare. The ordinance establishes the creation of a historic preservation board comprised of city residents with special interests and experiences in historic preservation. The board's purpose is to carry out the responsibilities of the city's voluntary historic preservation program according to Article 11 of the city's Land Development Code. The ordinance identifies processes used to aid in the protection of historic properties through the historic designation and the certificate of appropriateness processes. In order to designate a property as a historic landmark, a property must be at least 50 years old, meeting the following criteria. Criteria 1. Properties which are significant to the city history, architecture, archaeology, or culture, and possess an integrity of location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, or association. Criteria 2 is properties which are associated with distinctive elements of the social, political, economic, scientific, religious, prehistoric, and architectural history of the city, the state, or the nation. Criteria 3 is properties which are associated with the lives of persons significant in the cities, states, or nations past. Criteria 4 involves properties which embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, style, or method of construction or work of a master, or that possess high artistic value, or that represent a distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction. The fifth criteria involves properties which have yielded or are likely to yield information about the prehistory or history of the city. Sixth criteria involves properties which are listed in the National Register of Historic Places. If the property meets one or more of the criteria I went over, the property owner can apply for designation status to the Historic Preservation Board through the Historic Preservation Office, which will be located in the Community Development Department. Nominations for historic property status may be initiated by the Historic Preservation Board or the property owner. Once an application is received by the Historic Preservation Office, the city will prepare a designation report with the following information: a physical description of the building, structure, or site and its character-defining features accompanied by photographs, a statement of the historic, cultural, architectural, or other significance of the building, structure, or site as defined by the criteria for designation established by the Land Development Code, a description of the existing condition of the building, structure, or site, including any potential threats or other circumstances that may affect the integrity of the building, structure, or site, a statement of rehabilitative or adaptive use proposals, a location map showing relevant zoning and land use information, recommendations concerning the eligibility of the building, structure, or site for designation pursuant to the Historic Preservation Ordinance, and a listing of those features of the building, structure, or site which require specific historic preservation treatments. After the designation report has been prepared, the Historic Preservation Board will hold a public hearing on the application at the first available meeting within 8 weeks after receipt of the completed application. If the board recommends designation, the next stop is City Council, who may adopt an ordinance providing the recommended designation or deny the proposed designation without further hearing. The owner of the property proposed for designation will be provided with written notification by first-class mail at least 15 days prior to the final public hearing on the ordinance. Upon adoption of an ordinance by the City Council, the property will remain designated as historically significant unless the designation is removed by a subsequent ordinance of the City Council. The Council can remove a designation if one or more of the following criteria are met after receiving a recommendation to do so from the City Manager or the Historic Preservation Board. The subject property no longer meets the applicable criteria for designation. A additional information indicates that the subject property did not meet the applicable criteria for designation at the time it was so designated. An error was made in information provided by a professional in support of the application for designation of the subject property. A procedural error occurred in the designation process. Once a property has received a local historic designation, a certificate of appropriateness will be required for any of the following actions affecting the designated property. 1. Any construction, reconstruction, development, redevelopment, alteration, restoration, or rehabilitation, which requires a building permit from the city and affects the exterior of the structure involved. 2. The construction of any new structures in a historic district. 3. The relocation of any historic structure or any contributing structure located in a historic district. 4. The demolition of any locally designated historic property in formal review for designation, or any contributing structure located in a historic district. And 5. Any construction which may potentially affect the integrity of a designated archaeological site. A certificate of appropriateness will not be required for any work that constitutes ordinary maintenance, which would include the alteration, construction, reconstruction, repair, or interior remodeling of any historic structure that does not involve a significant change in material, design, or exterior appearance, performed in accordance with all the ordinances, rules, and regulations of the city. Also, nothing contained in the ordinance will prevent the alteration, construction, reconstruction, repair, or demolition of a designated structure on an emergency basis when the building official certifies in writing that such work is necessary for the purpose of correcting conditions determined to be dangerous to life, health, or property. For all the exterior improvements to a designated property, the property owner will submit an application for a certificate of appropriateness to the city's Historic Preservation Office. The application will be accompanied by plans, drawings, materials, or photographs as deemed necessary to describe the proposed alteration and enable the board to visualize the effect of the proposed alteration on the property. City staff will review the applications for completeness and will determine whether the certificate of appropriateness can be issued at a staff level or will need to be submitted to the board for review and consideration. If the action proposed in the application for a certificate of appropriateness is a minor alteration, then staff may review and grant a certificate of appropriateness without formal action by the board. If the proposed action is for work involving substantial improvement, relocation, new construction, or any work that will result in a change to the original appearance of the designated property, then the application will need to be submitted to the board for review and consideration. All applications requiring board review will be scheduled for a hearing by the board within 6 weeks from receipt of the completed application. At the hearing, the board shall approve with conditions, or deny the application. If, for any reason, the certificate of appropriateness is denied, the applicant will be able to appeal the decision to the City Council by filing a written notice of appeal with the city attorney.
The preservation of historic properties can provide benefits and incentives to both individual owners and the community. Designating a historic property both locally or in the National Register of Historic Places is a prestigious honor and officially recognizes the historic or architectural significance of the property. Historic preservation has proven economic, environmental, and social benefits. In most instances, the designation of a historic property improves marketability, increases property values, and allows access to financial incentives. Recent studies commissioned by the Florida Department of State found that property values in historic communities increased greater than in comparable non-historic communities. The study also showed that historic communities have less population decline, more walkability, and a greater sense of community. The protection of local historic structures can also enhance business recruitment potential. Companies continually relocate to communities that offer their workers a higher quality of life, which is greatly enhanced by successful local preservation programs. Local tax incentives. The historic property ad valorem tax exemption is designed to encourage the preservation and rehabilitation of properties that are historically significant. The exemption is available to owner-occupied residences and/or income-producing properties that are historically designated. The exemption is available for 100% of the assessed value of qualified improvements made to a property for a period of up to 10 years. For example, if the property is assessed by the property appraiser's office for $100,000 and $25,000 of qualifying rehabilitation improvements are made, the $25,000 will not be assessed for tax purposes for a period of 10 years. Code flexibility. Florida building codes allow for flexibility in their application to historic buildings. With this in mind, historic structures that do not strictly comply with the code can still be approved when it is shown that the purpose of the code provision has been addressed and no hazard will be created or allowed to continue. Section C-501-6 of the Florida Building Code states, no provisions of this code relating to the construction, repair, alteration, restoration, and movement of structures and change of occupancy shall be mandatory for historic buildings provided a report has been submitted to the code official and signed by a registered design professional or a representative of the State Historic Preservation Office or the Historic Preservation Authority having jurisdiction, demonstrating that compliance with that provision would threaten, degrade, or destroy the historic form, fabric, or function of the building. Variances. The City of Temple Terrace recognizes that many of the older significant properties were constructed prior to the enactment of some of the provisions in the zoning code and, therefore, are at times in non-compliance with the provisions of the code. As a result, many times when owners wish to make additions or modification to their properties, they find that variances from the zoning code are necessary in order to maintain the distinctiveness of the setting and architecture. Ordinance 1550 grants the Historic Preservation Board the authority to authorize variances from the provisions in Article 11 of the Land Development Code for properties having a historic designation, where the board expressly finds that the applicant has demonstrated that a literal enforcement of the provisions will result in undue and unnecessary hardships. There would be no need to appear before the Board of Adjustment, since the Historic Preservation Board is authorized to grant variances to owners of historically designated properties. Other incentives. No fees will be collected for local designation or certificates of appropriateness applications. Free technical assistance is offered by the Bureau of Historic Preservation. Communities have direct access to the State Historic Preservation Office for building assessments and general preservation assistance. Bronze markers will be placed on historic properties receiving local designations. The markers will recognize the importance of membership in the Historic Preservation Program. And lastly, photo displays of enrolled properties will be placed on the city's website.
Thank you for your technical assistance, sir. So we have had our Margot Chavez has joined us on the board. We're happy that you're here, that you made it here safely. So now we have our guest speaker, who is Mr. Danny Moody. Before I ask him to come up, I'll tell you a little bit about him. And he has approved all of these secrets, so none of them are, I'm not divulging anything. He grew up in Temple Terrace and is a King High alumni, and then got his Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from Florida College. He then earned a certificate degree from the International Preservation Studies Center in Illinois, and since that time has worked in the construction trade for 20 years. He owns and has restored and repaired a 1922 Temple Terrace original home where he now lives with his wife and 2 daughters. So welcome, Mr. Moody.
Hello. Thank you all for having me. We're going to do a quick overview on the Secretary of Interior Standards. You might have heard that mentioned briefly in the presentation. We're going to go over what it is, a brief history of why it came about, and also why we shouldn't be afraid of it as homeowners. As mentioned, my name is Danny Moody. I own a restoration company called Pro Historical, where we are dedicated to the restoration and preservation of historic structures in our local area. The Secretary of Interior Standards practices are something that we implement just about every day. Although I have almost never opened my National Park Service booklet for a reference on a job site. In my opinion, what is illustrated in the Secretary of Interior Standards is a very commonsensical suggestions to property repair on historic structures by restoration, preservation, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. And when I first started, I didn't realize there was a difference between those 4, but there is, and we'll get to that briefly. So the first question one might ask is, what does the National Park Service or the Department of the Interior have to do with old buildings? I had the same question when I first was introduced to the subject. So I'm just going to give you a brief history of why we're even talking about this and why this is part of this program. There's a brief history is that in 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act was established in the wake of some egregious demolitions that happened in the early 1960s. So the Preservation Act of 1966 is passed by Congress. The act requires that the federal government accelerate its historic preservation programs and activities. It authorizes the Secretary of the Interior, whose responsibilities designated in the act are delegated to the Director of the National Park Service, to expand and maintain a national register of historic places, to administer a program of direct grants for the preservation of properties included in the National Register, and to establish professional standards for the preservation of historical properties. The government established the National Park Service to issue a set of guidelines and tools to maintain and preserve historic structures in our communities. That would include providing guidelines, as we're going to go over, to allow for proper construction methods, administer grants, training tools, and for those looking to preserve our architectural integrity for generations to come. Basically, this all came about, for the most part, there was kind of a linchpin in it, but in the early 60s, historic Penn Station was demolished in New York City. It had 150-foot tall ceilings, marble columns, steel and glass, ceiling. It was a pretty ornate, kind of like the pride of the Gilded Age. And basically, it was just pulled for a permit and destroyed, no salvage, no nothing. And that got people kind of attuned to, hey, we should be doing a better job at preserving these things as opposed to just throwing them in the landfill. Just how wasteful, how economically impacting it was to do that. So that's where this all started. So after that event, architects got together and said, hey, let's put together something where we can help preserve these historic buildings. Let's get some tools together. Let's get the government behind it to fund it. I guess the National Park Service was doing a really good job at maintaining their parks at the time, so they issued in the National Park Service to do so. I'm just going to do a quick kind of show you all what Penn Station was. I mean, we have some pretty cool train stations and things like that here in Tampa, but nothing to this magnitude, and it was literally just destroyed over a number of years. So that's where this all started. So to get into the Secretary of the Interior standards, I know it sounds super stringent and educational, but it's really pretty basic. It's easily accessed. So we go here. There we go. So if you look up the Secretary of the Interior standards, easily come to this National Park Service website. All the information is there for what we're talking about. Basically, what this does is it provides standards and guidelines, as you see, for different methods of preservation. So if someone were to, like in our city, we all have Mediterranean revivals, most of us here that are in the 1920s historic portion of the city. We would look at certain guidelines from this website, or you can have a hard copy, I'm sure, too, of what would be appropriate for these different acts. Now, you can see on the important links side, on the right side of the screen, it says guidelines for preservation, guidelines for rehabilitation, guidelines for restoration, and then guidelines for reconstruction. So I didn't really think there was much of a difference before I started doing all this. I'm like, it kind of sounds like you're doing the same thing, but they are specifically different. And I just very quickly wanted to just explain those very quickly and give you a few examples of what that is. So preservation as treatment. I can go ahead and go there. Preservation is defined as the act or process of applying measures necessary to sustain the existing form, integrity, and materials of a historic property. Work including preliminary measures to protect and stabilize the property generally focus upon the ongoing maintenance and repair of historic materials and the features rather than extensive replacement and new construction. New exterior additions are not within the scope of this treatment. However, the limited and sensitive upgrading of mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems, and other code required work to make properties functional is appropriate within a preservation project. I like to think of preservation is, I would say, applies mostly to maybe a museum that you would see. The original fabric is wanted to be maintained as much as possible, and that's really not necessarily doing a full restoration and bringing it back, but you're trying to preserve as much as the original as possible. That is different from rehabilitation. So real quick, rehabilitation is defined as the act or process of making possible a compatible use for a property through repair, alterations, additions, while preserving those portions or features which convey its historical, cultural, and architectural values. So I think a good example of a rehabilitation would, again, probably not be one of our residential homes, but for instance, if Sutton Hall at Florida College, used to be the Golf and Country Club, if it were to be rehabilitated into a golf and country club, that would be a rehabilitation. However, they did an adaptive reuse, and it was a dormitory. So that is a little bit different, but again, rehabilitation doesn't really pertain to you or I as historic homeowners. Restoration is the next one. This is really the world I live in is restoration, and I think that what would apply to most of us as homeowners. So if we were to do work on our own homes and we apply for this program, we would want to look at the restoration guidelines for our house. So again, all this information, it's super vast on this website. It's not all going to apply to us. A lot of it's Victorian. There's even bungalow stuff that wouldn't even apply to us, but we can find useful tools in here to say, hey, this is a proper way to restore a historic structure. The good thing about that is not everybody has the technical or the skills to restore a historic structure, right? The guy that you maybe just pick up at Home Depot very well may not know what your house is built out of, and the best ways to replicate that. That's where this comes in. So if you hired a company like mine, that's what we do all the time. It's no problem. But if you hire a regular general contractor, handyman, whatever, they could use this resource to say, oh, okay, you have stucco. That's what I need to finish it. Like, oh, you have steel windows or wooden double hung windows. That's what, we're going to try to repair. Terracotta roofs, for example, it's really specific to our architectural style. So restoration is identified as the act or process of accurately depicting the form, features, and character of a property as it has appeared at a particular period of time by means of removal of features from other periods into its history and reconstruction of missing features from the restoration period. The limited and sensitive upgrade of mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems, and other code-required work to make properties functional is appropriate within a restoration. So, yeah, I know that was mentioned before, too, that this is not saying that you have to tear up your entire house to put in the new plumbing system that would apply to code. That this is actually protecting us as historic homeowners, and I've experienced this firsthand, is because this is a historic house, we're going to allow this to happen, as long as it's not unsafe or that it's going to, take away from the contributing structure. So that's the restoration is really the one that would apply to us, and I think that's the resource that we could really use. And then the last one is reconstruction. That's basically and I don't want to have to read it all, but the reconstruction, I would say that's mostly reflected in a lot of the museums that we see, not really applicable to us. A client of ours is Crackler Country down there by the state fairgrounds. I know everyone that went to Hillsborough County Public School went there for their kindergarten field trip. But they do they have old structures on the property. And they maintain them, but they also do replicas. So that's building it exactly how it was. You can't really do that because we can't dig out, 1,000-year-old trees and that kind of thing. But just so that they appear to be what they are. So yeah, like I said, this Secretary of Interior standard sounds like something that's pretty intimidating, but really it's just a good resource. And the breadth of this stuff, it is super extensive. There's hundreds of pages of resources. It's really only just a guideline to help us restore properly when we are not a professional ourselves. So, did we want to do any questions? Do we have time to do that? Afterwards? Okay. Yeah, so really I just wanted to introduce this to you all. This would be a useful source to the board, to any of us that are applying our homes, to say, hey, I've either done this already or this is something that I'm about to do. I would like to do it according to the interior standards because it's going to make my house look more appropriate, and we're going to ensure that it's done correctly and not going to be an eyesore to the community. So that's pretty much it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Not that I'm aging myself, but I cried all the way home from school when we drove past the Sulphur Springs Arcade and it had been flattened. So I can't imagine what it must have been like in New York City to see that building go. So our next speaker is another Temple Terrace person, Marissa Robinson, and she is the administrative assistant to the Community Development Director, Mike. She graduated from the College of Charleston with a degree in historic preservation and community planning. Her passion is researching historic properties. I won't tell you the children. I'm sure they come first. She also serves as the liaison between the public and the Historic Preservation Board in the city's Historic Preservation Office. Marissa.
good evening, and thank you all for coming. I just wanted to go over the website that we already have established for the Historic Preservation Office. When you go to the city's homepage, you can click on City Services and then Community Development. And it's over here on the side, along with our permitting and building and zoning information, we have the Historic Preservation Office. And on this site, you can view our ordinance, the application for designation, application for certificate of appropriateness, a little overview of our city's history, a video that was done a few years ago about the 7 original homes, and a map of the historic properties that we do have in Temple Terrace. I'll go over the application for you real quick. The initial spot will be for the Historic Preservation Office. This is where we'll determine what criteria your historic property falls under. We'll need the owner or applicant information. If you are applying for another person and you are not the owner, you will have to fill out an affidavit of authorized agent, and that will just give the owner giving you permission to designate their property for them. Some of the information we'll need for designation is a tax record indicating the principal structure is at least 50 years old, a written description of the historic culture, architectural, archaeology, or significance of the property, a legal description, and the boundary of the site structure, and then photographic documentation of the individual structures that are on the property. The owner will then have to sign and authorize the city to do its historic research. And then down here is where we have the affidavit of authorization. Panic. Go. The application for the certificate of appropriateness, again, we will need the property address, the owner's information, and contact information. Again, if somebody is applying for the owner, they will need the applicant information. We're also going to need the current zoning. Is it residential or commercial? Most of the time, this will be residential. If you are doing an addition or a renovation, what structural systems or elements that will be affected by this renovation, existing materials, and then proposed materials. A full description of the proposal of the alterations or construction, including materials, reasons for the addition. And then down here we have a checklist of the things that we will need for on the staff level's initial review. We'll need a complete application, which is what I just went over, a property record card that from the property appraiser's office, a survey, either of the existing boundary or the proposed site plan, elevations to scale of each side of the building that will be affected by the proposed work. Drawings must be to scale and clearly illustrated the detail of the work proposed. And then photographs of all the elevations. The reasons we're going to need photographs for both the designation and the certificate of appropriateness is documenting these historic structures throughout these processes will be able to help us determine what has been done previously to the house, and then we can see that evolution over time. So, and that's what I had. I'll turn it back over to Shem. All right. Thank you so much.
So we definitely had 2 Temple Terrace folks here, but now we've reached out to a neighbor from Plant City, and as she and I boasted today, she comes from the 2nd largest, and we come from the 3rd largest. So we have a lot in common here, and her love of her city is amazing. So our next speaker is Robin Baker, who is the Plant City's Planning and Zoning Coordinator. She is a certified AICP planner and certified public manager with over 20 years of experience in both the public and private sector. She actively represents Plant City and the planning process through the entire development review process and regularly appears before the City Commission, Planning Board, Historic Resource Board, and the Board of Adjustments at public hearings while supervising and managing day-to-day schedules, performance reviews, and training of planning staff. Her team continues to successfully navigate complex planning issues in a quickly growing city. Robin holds a BS in business from Lee University and obtained her certified public manager certification from Florida State University. Robin, thank you so much for coming.
Hi, good evening. Board members, Chair, thank you so much for having me here tonight. I do get really excited to come anywhere and talk about the city of Plant City. I was actually born in the Plant City Hospital and graduated from Plant City High School. I've lived there pretty much my whole life outside of a few years for college that I went to Tennessee for a bit. So it's an absolute honor to be part of the team that gets to not only shape the future of our city, but also to preserve its past. So before I get started, to give you a little bit of history about Plant City, Plant City was basically founded when Henry Plant ran the railroad from Jacksonville to Tampa and took it through Plant City. And that's actually where we get our name. A lot of people think Plant City is because of our agricultural history, but we're actually named after Henry Plant. In 1883, Mr. Henry Mitchell purchased about 40 acres where the two railroads came together. That was the Florida Southern Railroad and the Tropical Florida Railroad. And he began to develop that area around the intersection of those two railroads, which would essentially become our historic districts today. In 1885, by that time, the population was already 300 people. And in a vote of 49-1, Plant City was incorporated in 1885. And upon our centennial celebration, about 10 years after, in 1994, we established 3 historic districts. Some are larger than others, but all of these districts either encompass or are immediately adjacent to that downtown core. Now, the uniqueness of the development in this area and in the historic districts is that back in the 1800s, when the economy and industry began to boom, you started seeing that in the houses that were being built around the downtown core of Plant City. Community leaders as well as residents that came, they were building houses that were way more ornate and had a higher level of craftsmanship than a lot of the houses that you were seeing across the state. And so after our centennial celebration, it became important that we began to preserve those homes as we saw a lot of them begin to deteriorate. So these 3 districts were established. Our largest is our Northeast Historic Residential District, which has more than 200 properties in it. Now, we did things a little bit differently than the way that you're doing that. We established the districts and then allowed people to opt out of the district if they did not want to be in it. They had a certain time frame to do so. But then upon that, they were established in 1994 along with our code and our historic board. And then in 1995, they were added to the National Register of Historic Places, and we were able to obtain our certified local government. Now, in 1996, we established our historic design standards for that district, which had a lot of purposes that we'll discuss in a second. But the important thing about those standards was that it not only set standards for those historic homes, but for the non-contributing structures that were within the historic district as well. As they mentioned previously, the homes had to be older than 50 years at the time of designation for them to be considered contributing. And so we did have a number of structures that were considered non-contributing. They still have to follow the same rules, but when you're talking about restoration or replacement, we're looking at making sure that it fits into the fabric of the city, not particular speaking to a particular type of architecture. So there's different chapters throughout the standards that address those 2 different things. These standards were updated in 2013 to make a little bit more modern and pretty with, all the pretty pictures of all the properties that we're very proud of in Plant City. But the goals of those standards are to protect and reinforce the unique visual character of Plant City, increased awareness of architectural styles found in Plant City, protection of the architectural integrity of our historic districts, improvement of the quality design in those districts, provide advice and assistance to those owners of the historic buildings, and then to recommend strategies for new construction to maintain that character of the historic districts. We also require a certificate of appropriateness. We do not charge a fee for those applications to encourage homeowners to be part of the process. We also require that they submit samples as part of that, including color samples or roof shingles. They have to put all that as part of the record, because at the end of the day, that's what we're doing. We're creating a historic record of that home that will continue the life of that home. I brought one with me so you can see one of the properties that we're going to discuss in just a minute. This is the paper file on that house, which is kind of big for one house, right? But every time they've changed the paint color or painted the trim or changed out a window, we have a record of that in the file, which is just so beneficial to future owners of that home if you decide to sell someday. We also offer a couple of incentives that you heard about in the video. We do have a tax abatement program that allows for 10 years the tax assessment to be based on the pre-improvement value of the home. And then we also do take part in the grants that are available for commercial businesses only are eligible for $5,000 in facade grants each year to improve the outside of the business. So I wanted to showcase a few of the success stories in Plant City. There's so many, and it was really hard to limit it to just a few to keep my time down. But I'd like to show you some of our properties that have been true success stories. So this first house is 707 North Collins Street. It's almost immediately adjacent to the downtown core. It's a block from City Hall. And this is, we lovingly refer to as the Sparkman House. John Gadsden Sparkman was the first to move into this house. It was built in 1900. It's referred to as a Queen Anne architectural style. The Sparkmans moved into the house in 1910 and lived there until their passing in the late 60s. This particular house was, the picture on the right was taken in 2001. And at that time, there were some severe damage to the inside of the house. The roof had leaked. The floors were rotting. You could see all the way to the first floor from the second floor. There were a lot of problems with the house. This particular owner took part in the tax assessment program, was able to have the property appraiser come out and assess the value of the house at that time, which at that time was $48,000. And they were able to make the improvements to the house and not have their taxes go up for 10 years. So for almost 10 years, because she sold it before the end of the 10 years, but for almost 10 years, the taxes on that house were somewhere around $1,700 based on that original assessment. The house just recently sold after it became a bed and breakfast for a while. It's now in private residence again, just recently sold for $1.1 million. And the tax assessment on it today is a little over $800,000. So at the end of the day, it's, it generates revenue for the city and really preserves something that was part of the original history of our town, is still standing and enjoyed by all. This is what it looks like today. A lot of their improvements that were done were part of when it became a bed and breakfast. They made a lot of enhancements to it. For the most part, everything that's there was originally part of the house, except for the awnings that were added later for a little bit of shade on the windows. And then they did add shutters at some point. But everything else was originally there with just a little bit of color change. But it is a beautiful home. The next home I wanted to show you is 909 North Rouge Street. And I have two different pictures here for you to show how things can change over time. The picture on the left was taken in 1947, and this is the house in its original stature, which had a front porch. The upstairs looks a little bit different than it does today, and because of that non-curb appeal tree blocking our view, you can't really see if those are windows or if maybe that was a second floor porch at some point. But by the time we established the residential districts in the 90s, the house on the right is the picture that we have in the file. So you can see that they closed in that porch and opened up the porch on the second floor and made things a little bit different. And this house was originally built in 1898. And this is the house today. This is a local contractor that owns the house. She's done actually a lot of repairs throughout the historic district and really takes pride in our historic districts and the work that she does for others and the work she does on her own home. So again, this is one of our oldest houses in the district, again, built in the late 1800s, and it's just as beautiful today as it probably was then. The final is 803 West Reynolds Street. This particular house is actually owned and lived in by one of our Historic Resource Board members. And again, this one was built in 1906, and this is where you'll see what I mentioned before about some of our houses were more ornate than of the time, and a lot of the time you'll get two different architectural styles on the houses because a lot of time they were like frame vernacular, but then they had Victorian accents that were added, things like that. So this particular one is a Queen Anne Folk Victorian. It is a private residence. It was built originally in 1906, and some improvements have been made to the house, and this is the house today. I think the guardrail on the porch is a little questionable as to whether that's historic or not, but it's beautiful all the same. And then I just wanted to showcase a couple of our new construction homes. To me, that's the beauty of these districts that really fosters that pride that a lot of people have that live in these districts. I'll be honest, when I was a little girl driving through town, this was the area I wanted to live in. All the homes were so beautiful and everybody took such good care of the houses. And along came the standards and just made it that much easier to take care of this area. And that includes new construction for us. If unfortunately a house were to burn down or a natural disaster happens and we end up with a vacant piece of land, we know that what goes back in its place is going to fit into the fabric of our historic district. And then I just wanted to show you a few pictures. I concentrated on our residential success stories today, but we also have some commercial success stories in our downtown core. Britain's Cigar Bar is the newest to the list on the left-hand side there. That's actually a former gas station that operated downtown for years and years, and they used our facade grant to turn this into a very well-attended, lively place on the weekends. Everyone's loving it so far. On the far right, bottom right, that's our Ever Street improvement facade grant that was issued and done. We have a couple of bar type settings here in this, as well as some service industry as well. And then up on the top right, it is it's connected to McCall Park downtown, has really gone under some real great renovations on this particular street, and all took part in the facade grant to do so. And that's all I had.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So now it's your turn. You get to participate. Now, Jeannie, are you going to hand out a microphone? So if someone has a question, raise your hand. Jeannie will bring you a microphone, and then you can direct your question to someone specific, or if you don't, somebody will say, I'll take this, and they'll, or they may all answer. Who knows? We'll find out. So any questions? Oh, come on. She's looking at you because she knows that you said at dinner, I'm going to ask this one. No? Not yet? There we go. The microphone? Yeah, right here.
So in Plant City, it's an opt-out, but in Temple Terrace, it's an opt-in, correct? When we were hearing about the application, I thought I heard that the homeowner can make an application or the preservation board can designate. Did I hear that correctly? So does that mean that I, as a homeowner who choose not to opt in, could have the preservation board opt me in? No, that's my question.
It has to be with the consent of the property owner.
Yeah.
And I believe, Robin, didn't you say that there was a period of time where you can opt out because it was this historic district, but you don't in general have an opt-out clause, correct?
Actually, we do. Any homeowner at any time can petition to remove themselves from the historic district. I personally have never seen that happen, but they do have that option. Well, I take that back. I have seen that happen with actually public buildings have been removed from the historic district after the fact. And I think we've had a couple of churches that have removed themselves just because of the cost of the upkeep and that sort of thing. But the majority of the buildings that were removed were non-contributing structures, not historic structures.
There you go. The question back there.
Directed board members, who owns a Mediterranean Revival home? Who's on the board?
We also have an alternate on the board that also owns a historic home,
What do you consider those going?
a Mediterranean Revival.
No other questions. That means you're all ready to. Oh, there you go. Here's a question.
This is kind of the reverse situation from getting things preserved. Plant City allowed the Cal Cavalry monument to be removed from its location there in front of the school. How did that come about, and how can that be stopped in Temple Terrace so that things that there's a clamor for removal of something doesn't overcome the historic preservation value of a contributing asset? Because I think, that was a shame. And we've seen this in Hillsborough County, we've seen it in St. Augustine, we've seen it in Pensacola, a number of places where they say, oh, we don't like this item anymore because it commemorates an undesirable or a non-fashionable, non-politically correct era of history. And we, whoever we is, wants it removed. What kind of protections do we have to say that that can't be done? It was a failure in Plant City, quite frankly.
I hesitate to comment on the question because I was not involved in the process, the decision, or any of the conversations that were had as to whether it be removed or not removed. The historic guidelines that we have are just that. They're guidelines. We do our best to enforce them, but obviously there's always situations that have to be made by our leadership. Because I was not present at any of those conversations, I can't actually comment on that. But thank you.
Any other questions?
So
Yes.
what's going to be done in Temple Terrace?
Well, we have.
Own things, rather, so that they have to be taken away.
We'll have to take that as it comes to us. That has not been presented to us as our purview.
There's application and there's preservation, but there's nothing about forced removal.
And there isn't anything in the ordinance. Exactly. I have a question in the back. Okay. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So, hello, sir. Thanks for the question. I'll try and answer it. The ordinance we have is designated towards preservation primarily of residential properties in the city. And I'm not familiar with the one you were talking about, but it sounds to me like it was some type of monument maybe or statute or something like that. And and a lot of those are on publicly owned lands, which seems to, a lot of people don't want them on publicly owned lands. Certain types of monuments or statutes commemorating events or people. This ordinance is not designed to protect those. I'm not aware of any type of monuments like that in Temple Terrace that may arise. There may be something, but I'm not aware of it. But the focus here is for residential properties and commercial as well if they come up.
Thank you, Mike. I think you have a question in the back, Brett.
I just wanted to get clarification on the tax incentives. Is Temple Terrace doing the same as Plant City as far as offering 10 years of the pre-improvement value, having we will be taxed at that, and would that also be for commercial property?
Yes, ma'am. We have the same plan in place in the ordinance that any improvement that you have on your property will not be assessed for Temple Terrace taxes for a period of up to 10 years.
But when the cost you get down, you act on it. Then they go property.
Oh,
Got counted.
you'd be taxed on the $45,000, not on the improvements that you put on the property.
Okay, there we go.
And I apologize because I'm not well read on this topic, but the gentleman's comments made me wonder about our historic cemetery. Are there any plans to protect our historic cemetery?
As said before, those things have not been addressed in the ordinance, and I don't believe that any of us are planning on taking anything down. That's been preserved and been protected for quite a few years, and even those of us who just know about it know that it's been a protected area. So I don't know. Mike, would you want to take that question up as well?
The only cemetery, and forgive me if my knowledge isn't as it should be, is the one off Overlook Drive. Is that the one the cemetery you're talking about? Yes, sir. That's privately owned as far as I know, and from what I can tell, the city has no desire to remove any headstones or any monuments which may be in that property. If somebody petitions the city to remove it, I'm not sure what we would do. It would probably be up to the historic board, and I doubt that we would want to bring that.
You have a question? Yes.
On lesson that you had done. Are you accepting applications, or is this still on?
Marissa, would you like to take that?
We are currently accepting applications. We do have them available on the desk where Mr. Sherman and Ms. Shoshone are sitting. And we'd be happy, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have regarding the application. And you can always contact me by email. My business cards are up there for everybody.
Any other questions? Hearing none, we do have just a small bit of, because this is a public meeting, and before we close the meeting, we're going to not suspend. We're going to table the approval of the minutes until we've had a chance to read them and for the April 24th meeting. But we do need to decide on our next meeting. It has been recommended that we meet on August 28th at 5 p.m. in council chambers, which would allow for staff, if there are any applications, would allow for them to bring them to us at that time. So do I hear a motion or to approve that date?
Yes.
We have a motion from Margot. Do we have a second? From Maura. Any discussion? Okay, I'm calling for the vote. All those who approve the next meeting to be held on August 28th at 5 p.m. in council chambers, please say aye. Aye. Sounds like approved. Okay, is there any other business to come before this board? Ladies? No? Hearing none, I consider this meeting adjourned. Thank you again so much for coming. I so appreciate your attention. And thank you to the staff for all the work they've done to prepare this meeting.